Ankita Gupta is a PhD candidate at the Nicholas School of the Environment and a fellow in the von der Heyden Fellowship Program. Her dissertation aims to understand the role of water availability from irrigation canals in shaping the hydrology and ecological value of small wetlands in a rural agricultural setting. Centered on the wetlands of Gujarat, India, her research employs a mix of field surveys, remote sensing, GIS, and spatial modeling to understand waterbird distribution in relation to land use, water management, and agriculture. This work will highlight the biodiversity value of human-dominated ecosystems and promote conservation efforts that balance biodiversity preservation with natural resource access. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. And thanks to everyone for being here and for those who have joined on Zoom. As Rhiannon said, my name is Ankita Gupta, and I am super excited to be speaking here. I'll be talking about a part of my PhD research on the factors that shape waterbird diversity in agricultural wetlands influenced by irrigation canals. So let's quickly recall what counts as a wetland. According to the Ramsar Convention, wetlands are areas of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether not natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water where the depth at low tide does not exceed 6 meters. So you might notice that this definition captures the diverse forms of wetlands, from mangroves and lakes to rice paddies, irrigation ponds, and other aquaculture ponds as well. Although wetlands cover less than 3% of the surface of our planet, they contribute close to 40% of all renewable ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration, supply of fresh water, and nutrient cycling. Many of us actually depend on wetlands without even realizing it. They filter our water, prevent floods, and even help us grow the rice we eat. Coastal wetlands, for example, help prevent shoreline erosion. Mangroves protect coastal communities from extreme weather events such as cyclones. Wetlands also support diverse biological communities, including waterbirds, amphibians, and fish that rely on seasonal water availability. Invertebrates, aquatic plants that sustain food webs. Migratory birds that depend on wetlands as stopover sites. In fact, about 40% of the world's plant and animal species depend on wetlands in some or the other way, including 30% of all known fish species. Sadly, 70% of global wetlands have been lost since 1900s due to agricultural expansion, urban development, and hydrological modifications due to construction of dams and irrigation canals. Freshwater wildlife populations have declined by as much as 84% since 1970s, making wetlands one of the most threatened ecosystems worldwide. So one of the major causes of loss of wetlands is the global expansion of agriculture. This graph here depicts the area under cultivation since 1600s, and we can see a massive growth in agriculture since the past 100 years. Agriculture is in fact now a dominant global land use that has doubled in extent, especially in the tropics, over the last 60 years. And this has extensive impacts on natural habitats and wild species. So in agricultural areas, especially semi-natural habitat patches such as the hedgerows bordering cultivated fields and grasslands are very important for maintaining species diversity. For instance, wetlands in agricultural areas, including irrigation ponds or aquaculture ponds and rice fields, support aquatic, terrestrial, and amphibian species. Looking a little more deeply into wetland ecosystems, the biotic composition, structure, and function of wetland ecosystems is largely influenced by their hydrological regime. And this includes things such as the total area of water, the nutrient content, the fluctuation in water levels, etc. The variation in hydrological condition plays a major role in the population dynamics of wetland-dependent species through the influence on reproductive success, natural disturbances, and biotic composition. Anthropogenic alterations and use are substantially altering the hydrological regimes of wetlands. Specifically in agricultural areas, the inflow and withdrawal of water for irrigation to support seasonal cropping patterns can alter the hydrology of wetlands, and this can affect the different species which are dependent on these areas. How important is it to actually consider irrigation in agriculture? So, globally, 20% of agriculture is supported by irrigation canals. This map here shows the share of agricultural land in different parts of the world which is irrigated. So this area can range from 4% of the total cropped area in some African countries to as high as more than 50% in India. So irrigation canals can play a dual role in wetland ecosystems. On one hand, they can provide new habitats for different species, and they can enhance the dispersal of species across fragmented landscapes. On the other hand, they can alter water levels, affecting species that rely on the natural cycles of water. They can also facilitate invasive species and disrupt the native communities. So understanding these effects is key to making better conservation decisions. Let's pivot a little bit here and see what landscapes are actually important for supporting waterbird diversity. As you can see, these are some beautiful pictures of waterbirds. We would expect these to be from pristine lakes and other water bodies away from human habitation. However, these other pictures are also from the very same sites which support these waterbird species, as well as support human activities such as cattle herding and washing of clothes, for example. So in many parts of the world, including India, wetlands are multi-use landscapes and have been shared by human and wildlife for decades, if not centuries. In light of this, it is very important for us to ask, is it enough to just study and protect 5% of the total area, which is actually under different protections such as wildlife conservation areas? Especially when 42% of the area of the country is under cultivation. A large part of the country consists of small farmlands and habitation, as you can see in the remote sensing satellite imagery here, which is interspersed with lakes and ponds and other semi-natural patches of habitat. Which leads me to ask these questions. What drives the distribution of biodiversity in agricultural wetlands, and how can we make efficient conservation decisions? To answer these questions, in my research, I have multiple parts. In the first part, I use satellite imagery to detect areas of open water and wetland vegetation. I'm improving some existing methods which don't work very well in semi-arid agricultural landscapes in tropical regions, because in satellite images, areas of agriculture which are inundated with water can look very similar to floating vegetation in wetlands. Next, I am studying the seasonal drivers of waterbird diversity. So what is the relative role of open water versus wetland vegetation in supporting diversity of species? And do wetlands with more fluctuations in extent support a higher diversity of species? And lastly, I'm looking at the response of waterbird communities to hydrological changes imposed by irrigation canals. So do wetlands which are connected to canals support different waterbird communities than wetlands which are isolated? And is the response of waterbird communities seasonal? In this talk, I will focus on the second part of my work, which is understanding the seasonal drivers of waterbird diversity. I've conducted my work in Khera district of Gujarat in India. One of the reasons this region is interesting for studying waterbirds is because it lies in the Central Asian flyway, which is a migratory path used by more than 600 species of birds. So Khera district has a total geographical area of around 4,000 square kilometers, around 3.4% of which is classified as wetlands. I have digitized more than 2,000 wetlands in this district, which range in size from as small as 0.1 hectares to as large as 450 hectares. The majority of these wetlands are small lakes, ponds and tanks, which are embedded in a matrix of agricultural fields and rural housing. Most of these lakes and ponds are man-made, and they were constructed over the past century to store water for irrigation. So not really habitats which people would consider studying for biodiversity. They're also used for aquaculture, domestic water supply, brick making, grazing, cattle wallowing, and they are invaluable sources of income and nutrition, especially in rural areas. So Gujarat is mainly a dry and arid state and receives relatively low rainfall. So most of the agricultural land is dependent on irrigation, on cultivation, which also alters the hydrology of these wetlands. This map here shows my study sites. You can see here that the landscape is lined extensively with canals, and it also has many dams and wells. So these irrigation canals, shown in red color, they supply water to several reservoirs and ponds, and this alters their natural hydrology. Also, most of the rivers depicted in blue here, they are seasonal rivers, so they don't supply water throughout the year. My study sites include 76 wetlands, which were selected using an a priori design, using this hexagonal grid. I'll be happy to talk more about the sampling design after the talk if anyone is interested. For each of these 76 sites, I collected some hydrological variables using classification of sentinel to satellite imagery. And these include area of open water at each site, the area of wetland vegetation. So in this image here, it's not very clear on the projector here, but within the wetland, the sort of greenish area are the floating vegetation, and the darker blue areas are area of open water. I also calculated the area of wetland in the surrounding landscape, the seasonal change in extent, and once again, I'll be happy to go over the remote sensing classification methods later if anyone is interested. Moving on to the waterbird surveys. So first, let's have a look at this graph, which shows the average rainfall in Kerala throughout the year. And as you can see here, most of the rainfall occurs during monsoon, which starts in late June and lasts till around September or early October. So winter season here is the post-monsoon season, where there is more water in the landscape, and also it's when this region hosts the migratory wintering species. Just for context, winter in this region has temperatures from 53 to around 84 Fahrenheit, so it's not really winter, it's quite warm. Many waterbird studies are typically carried out in this season due to the presence of more water and migratory species, and this is also one of the seasons when I carried out my survey. In addition, I also did a survey during summer, which is right before monsoon hits, and when the wetlands are expected to have the lowest water levels. Once again, for context, the temperatures range between around 78 to 107 Fahrenheit, which is also one of the reasons why many surveys are not carried out in the season, because it's very, very, very hot. So during these two seasons, I did dependent double observer point counts, which is basically when another observer and I stood at some locations around the wetlands, and we recorded all the birds which we could see within some distance of the waterline and within the parts of the wetlands which we could see. And we did these counts for a fixed time period of 10 minutes at each point. So what did we see in these surveys? We observed more than 110 species of birds, half of which were waterbirds. So in summer, we observed 48 species of waterbirds, and in winter, we observed 55 species. And these include species of conservation concern, such as the oriental darter, black-tailed godwit, painted stork, and black-headed ibis. And this supports the importance of these agricultural ponds for biodiversity. Next, based on these observations, I calculated some measures of biodiversity for each site and for each survey season. These include species richness, which, as expected, is the number of species at a site. So at this cartoon site I've shown here, there are 7 different species, so the species richness is 7. Next, waterbird abundance refers to the number of individual birds at a site, which brings us to our pop quiz for the audience. What do you think is the abundance of waterbirds in this wetland here? Anyone? So it's basically counting just the number of individuals. So exactly, it's 16. So there are 16 individuals here, so the waterbird abundance is 16. Next up is Shannon diversity, which is basically a measure of how many species are present in a community and how evenly they are distributed. So the Shannon diversity of this site here is 1.75. This number doesn't really mean anything in our heads, so to better interpret this, let's look at a comparison between 2 sites. So both these sites, A and B, have a species richness of 7, which means there are 7 different species present, and there are also total 16 individuals. Yet the Shannon diversity of these is different. The second site has a lower diversity. That's because the first site, site A, has a relatively more even distribution of individuals between different species. Next, to understand functional richness and functional divergence, let's first look at what is an ecological niche. This refers to the specific role a species occupies within an ecosystem. And this includes a range of environmental conditions it can tolerate, the resources it can utilize, its interactions with other organisms in that environment. It essentially describes how a species makes its living in its habitat. And this includes both the physical space and the functional role of the species within that space. Apologies for any ecologists present here who already know all this. So let's look at an example. This is the pied kingfisher. It's a predator of small aquatic animals such as fish. Its role in the ecosystem is, one of the roles is that it helps to regulate fish populations. And it occupies water sources which have perches for diving, which it uses for hunting the fish. In this picture, it's perched on a wire which runs over the wetland. Next, we look at the gray-headed swamp hen, which is primarily herbivorous. It forages by wading, swimming, or climbing to reach the aquatic vegetation, insects, and animal prey. It generally inhabits shallowly flooded wetlands with open or semi-open emergent vegetation. So both these species occupy different spaces and have varying functions, even though they might be present at the same site. So, moving on, functional richness refers to the amount of ecological niches which are occupied by different species within a community. It essentially measures how diverse the functional roles of species are within a given environment. So unlike species richness, functional richness also considers different traits of a species, such as their size, diet, or their dispersal abilities, and it assesses how well they are able to utilize different parts of the habitat. For example, a pond with only small herbivorous waterbirds will have low functional richness because it lacks species with different feeding strategies or size ranges. On the other hand, a pond which has small herbivores, large carnivores, mid-sized omnivores would have high functional richness because there are diverse functional roles of the species which are present there. Functional divergence, on the other hand, it represents how the abundance is spread across different functional traits. A site with high functional richness can have low functional divergence and vice versa. So all in all, these 5 indices each tell a different story of the waterbird community which are present at different sites. Coming back to this figure here, Based on our recent understanding of ecological niches, we know that depending on species characteristics, such as foraging strategy and nesting site preferences, birds have different habitat requirements and therefore they utilize different parts of a wetland. Diving birds, for example, need deep water to forage, while dabbling and wading birds mainly reside in shallow water and along the edges of a wetland. Nesting sites can include spaces such as the ground along the wetland shore, amongst the vegetation in a wetland, or on floating vegetation or islands. In addition to the large variation of habitat requirement between species, these requirements can also vary between seasons, since birds have different needs for migration, breeding, and overwintering between different seasons. In general, large wetlands, which have more heterogeneity of habitats available, can promote a high species richness and higher abundance of birds. In addition to size, the fluctuation in water levels throughout the year is also important for maintaining a diverse vegetation, which in turn is associated with higher species richness of birds. And that's because wetland vegetation can provide habitat, it can increase the availability of food, both as a direct source of food to the herbivorous birds, and also by providing habitat to the prey for the carnivorous birds. So this leads to these questions. The first is, what is the relative role of area of open water versus wetland vegetation in driving diversity of water birds? Next, do wetlands with higher seasonal fluctuations in extent support higher diversity? And thirdly, do these relationships vary seasonally? So let's dive directly into the findings. This graph here shows 3 different measures of biodiversity. So it's percentage change in species richness, in waterbird count, and absolute change in the Shannon diversity. And the 2 things which are highlighted in the box on the y-axis, the one with OW represents the area of open water, and the one with WV represents the area of wetland vegetation. So as we can see, so the red line is for summer and the blue line is for winter. So if we look at wetland vegetation, which is WV, we can see it's positively associated with all 3 measures in both seasons. So species richness, abundance, and diversity all increase with an increase in vegetated areas of wetland. For instance, wetlands which have double the area of vegetation have around 40% more number of water birds in summer and approximately 23% more in winter. On the other hand, if we look at the area of open water, it's only positively associated with species richness in summer. Next, if we look at the measures of functional diversity, which are functional richness and functional divergence, again, we can see that the area of wetland vegetation is positively associated with both the measures in winter, and it's positively associated with functional richness in summer. On the other hand, the area of open water is only associated with an increase of functional richness in summer. What does this actually mean? It shows that wetland vegetation is essential for supporting waterbird diversity, and these relationships are seasonal. So a measure of hydrology which is important in one season may not be important in the other. Next, let's look at seasonal change. So wetlands don't remain constant throughout the year. They are dynamic ecosystems. They keep changing based on a lot of factors, such as rainfall or the runoff they're receiving from the surrounding landscape, or water they're receiving from irrigation canals, for instance. These 2 images here are for the same wetland in February and October of the same year. And you can see that the area of wetland vegetation increases drastically from February to October. So it's very important to look at how these ecosystems change throughout the year. So this graph here represents, on the x-axis is the summer wetland extent of my sites, and on the y-axis is the extent of wetlands in winter. The points, the size of the points represent the absolute change between summer and winter. So points which lie above this red dotted line increase in extent during winter, and the points which lie below this line shrink during winter. This inset here is just zooming in on the smaller ponds. So what we get from this is that wetland extent can vary drastically between seasons irrespective of the actual size of the wetland. For example, the larger wetlands which are shown on the top can also change a lot in extent, or they can change a little bit, and the smaller wetlands as well can expand a lot in winter. So what is the effect of this on different measures of diversity in both the seasons? Once again, we have this figure with measures such as species richness, waterbird count, and diversity. On the x-axis, C1 here represents wetlands which have a small change between summer and winter, so they change less than 2 hectares, and C2 represents wetlands which expand more than 2 hectares in winters, and they are being compared to wetlands which shrink during winter. So we can see that this change has no effect on these measures in winter, but it does have an effect in summer. So in summer, wetlands which expand more than 2 hectares have higher species richness and abundance than wetlands which actually shrink. So just to wrap our heads around it, the seasonal change in extent is affecting the measures of diversity in a particular season. Next, let's look at whether these relationships are different for trophic levels. So as we already talked about this, that the dietary requirement of species is very variable. So for a primary consumer such as the bronze-winged jacana, which is dependent on wetland vegetation, it has very different requirements than an egret, which feeds on other species such as fish or aquatic invertebrates. So our hypothesis would be that species which are at a higher trophic level would benefit even more from presence of larger habitat because they have different dietary requirements. Which leads to the question, does the species and abundance area relationship scale differently across trophic levels? Once again, coming to these results, on the x-axis, we have the area of the wetland, and on the y-axis, on the top, we have species richness, and below we have the abundance of waterbirds. The graphs on the left are for summer, and on the right are for winter. So we see that species richness of primary consumers, which is the light blue line, and for the top consumers, which is the dark green line here, it increases more steeply with area as compared to the secondary and tertiary consumers. And when we look at abundance, we see that the light blue line, which is for primary consumers, it increases more steeply with area compared to other trophic levels. What drives these relationships with wetland area? Is it more because of the presence of more open water, or is it more because of the presence of more wetland vegetation? So these plots here are for area of open water. So we see that the abundance of primary consumers increases more steeply with area of open water, and that's it. When we look at species richness, there is no statistical difference between the trophic levels, so they scale almost similarly with increase in area. It's only abundance of our primary consumers which scales more steeply with area of open water. And then when we look at the area of wetland vegetation, we can see that the species richness of primary consumers and top consumers increases more steeply with area of wetland vegetation compared to secondary and tertiary consumers. And when we look at abundance, again, the light blue line, which is primary consumers, increases more steeply with area of wetland vegetation in both the seasons. So this shows us that species and abundance area relationships scale differently across trophic levels, and larger areas of wetlands are essential for primary consumers and top carnivores. And lastly, let's look at whether these relationships are also different for resident versus migratory species. So these figures here are for area of wetland vegetation and species richness and waterbird abundance. The green line is for resident species and the pink line is for migratory species. So there is a difference in how resident and migratory species respond to increase in area of wetland vegetation in summer. So as the area of wetland vegetation increases, the species richness and abundance of resident birds increases more steeply as compared to migratory species, which basically means that migratory species are not that affected by increasing area of wetland vegetation. In winters, there was no difference in species area and abundance area relationships of migratory and resident species at the site level. So whatever we have measured till now is for the area of vegetation or open water at specific sites. If we increase the scope to look at the wetland vegetation or open water in the surrounding landscape, then we do see a relationship for migratory versus resident species in winter. So we see that sorry, I'm a little thrown off because the graphs are showing a little messed up with the screen here. But when we consider the area of wetland vegetation in the surrounding landscape, then the species richness of resident birds increases, whereas the species richness of migratory bird decreases. I would take the decrease here with a pinch of salt because it's also a smaller sample size and we have fewer migratory species compared to resident species, but we do see that there is a difference. This means that small wetlands are equally important for supporting migratory species, and they likely depend on factors at a much, much larger spatial scale since they are coming from very far away, and the decision-making on what sites and habitats to choose is very different from resident birds. Apart from the things I've considered in this study, there are also a lot of additional considerations such as the slope of the shoreline. So wetlands can have steep slope versus very gradual slope, and this could provide different habitats or food for different species. It can depend on the complexity of the shoreline, on the vegetation present specifically along the shore, on the depth of the water. So since the vegetation I calculated was from satellite imagery, I only had the floating vegetation, but there is also submerged vegetation in wetlands, which can provide habitat and food for many different species. Biodiversity can also be affected by different wetland use activities, such as drawing of water for irrigation or wallowing of cattle, and then also on the nutrients in the water, conductivity, temperature. Despite all this, we can still have some key insights from these findings. Firstly, it is very important to integrate conservation into agricultural landscapes, especially in countries like India, where a lot of the area is under agriculture, yet it supports very high biodiversity. It's important to protect both large and small wetlands and not just the larger sites. It's very important to observe the seasonal influence of different hydrological and landscape factors before we make conservation decisions, because as we saw, species respond differently to different factors in 2 seasons. So if we have done our surveys only during, for example, the winter season, and we make decisions to protect some areas based on that, that might not be the most optimal decision. It's very important to maintain seasonal water fluctuations because wetlands with different water levels throughout the year have more diverse habitats, and they can support more species. And then it's important to integrate strategies for migratory and resident birds. Thank you so much. A huge thanks to everyone who has supported my research till now, and yeah, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you for that presentation. Is there anybody in the room that wants to start off questions? Anybody here?
Thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
So I guess I have two questions, but the first is about your method. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the point count surveys that you did. And I guess what I'm thinking of is wetland birds are notoriously difficult to spot
Yes.
because many of them are quite skulky and they hide among the reeds and the vegetation. And it seems like you did 10-minute point counts. So I guess I'm wondering, did you listen for birds? Was that a part of your
Yes.
surveys? And how do you account for that potential bias of not seeing or detecting the very notoriously skulky birds that are difficult to find?
Yeah.
And then I guess the follow-up question, unrelated, is could you maybe speak briefly about how this ties to issues of global justice and equity? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the questions. So first, about accounting for biases in detection. The approach we used is called double dependent point counts, and it's basically when two observers are standing at a point. One observer is the primary observer, and the other is the secondary observer. So the secondary observer is the one who's taking notes. The primary observer either hears or sees a species, calls that out, and the secondary observer takes notes. And the secondary observer also notes what they are seeing without saying it out aloud. So the primary observer does not know what the secondary observer is saying. And this approach can be used, and then they switch roles between different points and sites. And this is used to calculate detection probability for different species for the two observers. And we scale that to get our estimates of true detection. Of course, it's nowhere close to what actually the species or abundance would be, but you can get an estimate of what higher bias is. To answer the second, does this answer the first question? Okay, I mean, there are birds which are notorious to see, and obviously we would have missed a few birds, but most of these wetlands are small and they are open areas. So some of them do have some bushes around the side, but they also have a lot of open water. So hopefully we saw quite a few species which were present. Secondly, how this relates to issues of global justice and equity. So most of conservation decisions have happened on this fortress conservation model, which assumes that biodiversity and humans cannot coexist, which has led to the creation of protected areas, which includes excluding the local populations from these protected areas. And this has led to the marginalization of a lot of communities. And a lot of the narrative around these sort of agricultural areas is more about wildlife-human conflict and not about wildlife-human coexistence. So the story I eventually want to tell and the work I want to do is on such landscapes where wildlife and humans have coexisted since centuries. And I mean, this is just PhD research, so obviously it is on a very small scale. But hopefully I want to build this up so that we can work with the communities in these regions for co-benefits for both their livelihoods as well as protection of species, which they have anyway protected for years and years and years. Thank you so much.
I actually have a question myself. While you were spending all that time observing out in the field, did you see any strange behaviors or anything notable that's different from the wildlife that we may see around here or in the Durham area?
Oh, absolutely. I can go on and on about this. Uh, so, to anyone who has not been to countries like India, it would be very tough to imagine what agricultural and farming areas can look like here. So, if you go sort of farther away from the main city, Durham area, maybe if you go to some agricultural areas, it's mainly vast tracts of land with, and you see almost no humans there, right? Because they're mainly managed by machines. And you also see very little biodiversity. Whereas if you go to these landscapes, one, it's full of people. Second, it's full of many, many, many species. And I have not put this image, I think, in my slides, but it's very common to see sites such as there is a farmer tilling the land, and right behind him, a few meters away, is a nesting site of a sarus crane, which is like this. It's like very tall flying bird. It's the tallest flying bird in the world. So there is an amazing coexistence of humans with wildlife.
Awesome talk, Ankita. I'm wondering, kind of following this human coexistence trend, and I'm not sure if I have this right, so also asking you to clarify, essentially. So you were looking at irrigation and also natural waterways, and they all had human use? Is that correct? Like, they all have an assumed baseline human use?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm wondering if, and this might lead to your other dissertation research or your hopes and dreams, kind of this, if the human use changes seasonally as the water levels change and kind of the landscape changes, and if you think that that might kind of support or bolster different wildlife, and or kind of how those systems work together as the seasons change, the human and the natural systems.
Thank you for the question, Dana. And yes, this does lead to my future hopes and dreams. Yes, the human use does change across seasons because, of course, there's harvesting versus sowing, and there are some seasons where there's almost no work to be done in the farmlands. And I'm sure this does affect how these systems are used by wildlife, because some species are actually solely dependent on rice paddies, for example. In fact, as I mentioned, of about the 1,300 bird species in India, around 350 are dependent on rice paddies. So, was this your question, or was there something else? Sorry.
Do we think that human use positively impacts these species, and as it declines in the summer, that leads to any changes as well?
I cannot certainly comment, but anecdotally from what I see, it has both positive, negative impact on some species. So some species are present more where there is less human presence, whereas others don't really seem to care. They will sit right beside 5 people who are working or drawing water from the wetland. And some might benefit from the use. For example, if you're drawing water for agriculture, that opens up some of the area of the wetland for vegetation to grow, so it indirectly benefits a lot of species. So, yeah, I'm sure the cycles of biodiversity are related to the cycles of human use in some way.
Okay, do we have any more questions in the room before we close up? Okay, we want to give another round of applause.
Thank you so much.